Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 10th installment of Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History. Today we're going to continue discussing the Babylonian exile in more detail, and then eventually we're going to get back to our general chronology. Again, I'm no expert on this subject, so I will be following a text by Mordecai Kogan called Into Exile. So I'm going to give a very quick timeline to recap what we've been going over and to give you a refresher. So in 609 BC, we had the death of Josiah. Remember that Josiah is credited to have established the Hebrew Scriptures during what we call the Deuteronomic Reform. From 609 to about 598 BC, we have the reign of Jehoiakim. This was a king who began giving tribute to Nebuchadnezzar or Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC, and in 598 we have the first deportation. So 598 to 597, Jehoiakim rules, and there is a siege at Jerusalem, and the city is taken captive. The second deportations begin on March 16th, 597. So, in 597 BC, Zedekiah is made king of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. In 594 BC, we have an anti-Babylonian conspiracy going on, and this is what triggers the next siege and the fall of Jerusalem when Solomon's temple, the first temple, was destroyed in 588 BC. We get a third wave of deportations in the months of July and August of 587 BC. So in 583 BC, Gedaliah, the Babylonian appointed governor of Judah, is assassinated. So lots of Jews flee to Egypt, and there is a fourth deportation to Babylon that occurs during this year. In 562 BC, Jehoiakim is released from Babylonian prison after 37 years in captivity. He remains in Babylon. Now let's fast forward quite a few years. We're now in 539 BC. The Persians conquer Babylon in the month of October. And in 538 BC, Cyrus, the king of Persia, permits the Jews to return to Jerusalem. Between 520 and 515 BC, we have many Jews returned to Judah under Zerubbabel and Joshua, who was a high priest. And it's in this period that the foundations of the Second Temple are laid. Okay, so let's talk about the Babylonian Captivity or the Babylonian exile in more detail. This was a period of time in which a number of Jews from the tribe of Judah specifically, remember we have the two tribes to the south, Benjamin and Judah, and then we have the 10 tribes to the north. We call these 10 tribes Israel, and we call the southern two tribes Benjamin and Judah. So Judah was taken captive in Babylon. After the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem. Judah was on the wrong side of the Battle of Carchemish. This was a war between the allied armies of Egypt and Assyria against Babylon. And this battle set the stage for Babylon's ascendancy to power and Assyria's descent. This was a decisive Babylonian victory, and it really put an end to Egyptian intervention in the Near East. Egypt turns insular again after this battle, and will stay insular until the Hellenistic period, when the Ptolemaic dynasty rules over Egypt. Okay, so King Jehoiakim of Judah is forced to pay a tribute to Babylon as a result of being on the losing side of this battle. Jehoiakim refuses to pay the tribute to Nebuchadnezzar in the 4th year, and this leads to another siege that culminates with the death of Jehoiakim. Following the death of this king, many of Judah's elites, the king's court, the nobles of the city, and the high priests, these men and women are taken into captivity and put under a watchful eye in the city of Babylonia. They're physically moved so that they can be watched. So there are a number of deportations that occur. There are 3 or 4 at least. The dates and the numbers of people who were deported are given in the biblical narrative, but these are not very accurate numbers. The problem in the biblical narrative is that they provide a variety of numbers as to how many people were deported. There are contradictions in numbers. The problem with this is that historians only have biblical sources to work with. We don't have Babylonian records as to how many individuals were captured from Judah and brought to Babylonia. But in any case, archaeological studies have revealed that not all the people of Judah were deported, and although Jerusalem was basically leveled and razed, other parts of Judah continued to be inhabited during the period of the exile. This would ultimately create a tension between those people who remained in Judah and those people from Judah who were exiled for many, many years and eventually returned. The return of the exiles would have to be a gradual process rather than a single event. And there are a lot of people who were deported who married, had families, and their descendants just didn't return. They were fully assimilated into the Babylonian system. Okay, so let's talk about the biblical account of the exile. In the late 7th century BC, in the 600s, the kingdom of Judah was a client state to the Assyrian Empire. In the last decades of this century, Assyria was overthrown by Babylon, which was at the time an Assyrian province. So, fearing the sudden rise of these Neo-Babylonians, Egypt seized control of Assyrian territory up to the Euphrates River in Syria. Babylon, however, couldn't allow this, and they sent for a counterattack. It was during this battle, at the Battle of Megiddo in 609 BC, that Josiah, the king who initiated the Deuteronomic reforms, was killed. He was killed by the Egyptians. We don't really know how. So after the defeat of Pharaoh Necho's army by the Babylonians at Carchemish in 605 BC, Jehoiakim begins paying his tribute to Nebuchadnezzar II, and young nobility are taken off to Babylon. This is where we get the story of Daniel, or the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow down before the idols of the Babylonian people. The story has it they are thrown in a giant flaming oven, in order to incinerate them because of their refusal to worship. And the Lord sets his hand over them, and they are protected from the fire. They come out, and everyone sees how great the God of the Jews is. Of course, this story is only found in the Hebrew Scriptures. So, in the following years, the court of Jerusalem was divided into two parties. There was one in support of Egypt, and there was one in support of Babylon. So after Nebuchadnezzar is defeated in 601 BC by Egypt, Judah revolts against Babylon, and this culminates in a 3-month siege of Jerusalem starting in 598 BC. Jehoiakim, he dies during this siege, and he's succeeded by his son Jehoiakim, or Jeconiah. He is only 18 years old at the accession of the throne. So the city falls on March 16th, 597 BC. Nebuchadnezzar pillages Jerusalem, he destroys its temple, and he takes Jeconiah, or Jehoiakim, the son of Jehoiakim, captive. His court and a bunch of prominent citizens are taken back to Babylon. Among these people is the prophet Ezekiel. So Jehoiakim's uncle, Zedekiah, is appointed king in his place, and the exiles in Babylon continue to consider Jeconiah, or Jehoiakim, as their exilarch, their rightful ruler in exile. In spite of Jeremiah, the prophet, in spite of his warnings and others of a pro-Babylonian nature, Zedekiah revolts against Babylon and enters into an alliance with the Pharaoh of Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar returns, defeats the Egyptians, and decides to lay waste to Jerusalem because of their treachery. The city is completely razed in 587 BC. Nebuchadnezzar rips down all of the walls, and the temple is completely dismantled. It had been sacked and pillaged in the previous attack by Nebuchadnezzar, and here Nebuchadnezzar had had enough and decided to wreck the temple entirely. He also dismantles the houses of Judah's most prominent citizens. So Zedekiah, the treacherous ruler, is blinded. They poke out his eyes with hot iron rods, and he's taken to Babylon with many more captives. It's at this point that Judah becomes a Babylonian province called Yehud Medinata. It's just an Aramaic name for the province of Judah. This destruction puts a complete end to the independent kingdom of Judah. So the first governor appointed by Babylon was Gedaliah. He was a native of the area of Judah, and he encouraged many Jews who had fled the surrounding countryside, regions such as Moab, Ammon, and Edom, to return. He takes all the necessary precautions to return the country to its former prosperity. So sometime later, a surviving member of the royal family assassinates Gedaliah and his Babylonian advisors, and this prompts many refugees to escape to Egypt because they remembered what had happened as a result of Zedekiah's revolt against Babylon. So by this period, there were significant Jewish communities in both Babylon and Egypt, and this was the beginning of numerous Jewish communities living permanently outside of Judah. This is the first of the Jewish diasporas, a theme which will become very, very prominent in the history of Israel. So, according to the book of Ezra, the Persian king Cyrus the Great, the first of the Achaemenid kings, ends the exile in 538 BCE once he had captured Babylon. And the exile ends with the return of Zerubbabel, the prince. They call him this because he's a descendant in the royal line of David. And Cyrus allows for the construction of the second temple in the period 521 to 516 BC. According to the Bible, once the Jews had returned to Jerusalem following the decree of Cyrus the Great, construction began at the original site of Solomon's temple, which remained a devastated heap for about 70 years of captivity. Alright, so we've looked at what the Bible has to say. Let's look at what the archaeological record and non-biblical evidence have to say. So, Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Jerusalem, his capture of King Jeconiah, and his appointment of Zedekiah in his place, and the plunder of the city in 597 BC, as described in 2 Kings, all of these things are confirmed by a passage in Babylonian Chronicles. The Chronicles read, "In the 7th year, in the month of Kislev, the king of Akkad mustered his troops, marched to the Hatti land, and encamped against the city of Judah. And on the 9th day of the month of Adar, he seized the city and captured the king. He appointed there a king of his own choice, and taking heavy tribute, brought it back to Babylon." So there is clear archaeological evidence of the destruction of many towns around the year 588 and 586 BC. It's been calculated that before the Babylonian destruction of Judah, the population of Judah was approximately 75,000 people. If we take the biblical numbers of exiles at their highest, 20,000, this would mean that about 25% of the population was deported to Babylon. The remaining 75% stayed in Judah. And now, although Jerusalem was destroyed and depopulated, there were large parts of the city that remained in ruins for about 150 years, and numerous settlements in Judah continued to be inhabited with no signs of visible disruption in the archaeological record. So, a very important document in this story is the Cyrus Cylinder. This is a very important tablet upon which was written a declaration in the name of Cyrus, referring to the restoration of the temple and the repatriation of the exiled people. This Cyrus Cylinder has often been taken as a corroborating source in regards to the authenticity of the biblical decrees attributed to Cyrus. Other scholars, however, point out that the cylinder's text is specific to Babylon and Mesopotamia and makes no mention of Judah or Jerusalem at all. In any case, there was a general policy of allowing deportees to return and establish their own cult sites. The return was a sort of trickle rather than a single event. Now, it's very common to look at Cyrus's behavior and retro-project some sort of specific love for the Jewish people in Cyrus's heart, because he allowed them to return and he allowed them to rebuild the temple. But, this doesn't take into consideration how the ancients viewed religions. Remember that pagans are syncretic. They want to fuse multiple religions together to gain the most benefit possible. If Cyrus supported the restoration of the temple in Judah, he would have one extra divinity on his side. There's no reason to think that Cyrus somehow acknowledged the supreme power of the Hebrew God above all of his own gods. He just wanted to, let's say, diversify his portfolio. So under the Persian Empire, Judah became the province of Judah. It had different borders and it covered a smaller territory. The population was greatly reduced from that of the earlier kingdom. There were about 30,000 people in the 5th to the 4th centuries BC in the province of Judah. So what about this whole exile? Remember a couple lectures back, we talked about this cycle of loss and redemption, of Israel wandering astray, and then Yahweh raising up its enemies in order to punish them for their wanderings. The Babylonian captivity is presented in the same way. It's a punishment for idolatry and disobedience to God, and it is presented similarly to the deliverance of the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt. It was during this period that the current Hebrew script was adopted. This replaced a traditional Israelite script. This was also the high point of biblical prophecy, prophets like Ezekiel. It was during this time that Jewish culture became very textual, very oriented around script, sacred texts, the Torah. Reading the law, the book of the law, became a central part of Jewish life. The Torah was redacted and altered during this period. The Jewish people underwent a transformation during this period as they began to conglomerate around the texts, the authoritative texts, such as the Torah, instead of stressing the centrality of the temple. The temple was gone. It was the book of the law which had to replace it. The Torah would become the glue that held Jewish culture together. So another major change that happened in Jewish culture was that prior to the exile, the people of Israel were organized according to their tribe. Following the exile, they would be organized by smaller family groups or clans. The only tribe that continued to exist was the tribe of Levi, and these would become the priest caste in Judah. If you wanted to be a priest in the Second Temple, you had to come from the line of Tzadok, who was from the tribe of Levi. This is where we get the word Sadducee, from Tzadok. So in rabbinic literature, Babylon would become a metaphor for the Jewish diaspora. The term Babylon would begin to have great significance all throughout the Western world as a symbol of departure from God's grace. If you live in Babylon, you live outside the grace of God. You are unaware. You are idolatrous. You might hear someone refer today to America as Babylon. This idea of Babylon plays a role in Rastafarianism, where the new Israel must fight against his captivity in Babylon. In the Middle Ages, the Avignon papacy, this was a period of 7 popes who ruled in France rather than in Rome between the year 1309 and 1377 AD. This was called the Babylonian Captivity of the papacy. A very famous psalm that many people refer to is Psalm 137:1. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors demanded of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried, tear it down to its foundations. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. I will praise you, Lord, with all my heart. Before the gods I will sing your praise. I will bow down toward your holy temple and give thanks to your name for your loving kindness and your truth. For you have magnified your word according to all your name. I will bow down toward your holy temple and will praise your name for your unfailing love and your faithfulness, for you have so exalted your solemn decree that it surpasses your fame. So this whole ordeal, this captivity, becomes a metaphor which will permeate history. A metaphor of sin, of deliverance into enemy hands, and then of rescue. The concept of Babylon would become the archetypal concept of spiritual wandering, of being lost, of dwelling among pagans. The exile represented the first foreign experience for a lot of Judeans. The exile saw the creation of countless immigrant communities scattered throughout the Near East. Lots of Jews lived in safe havens where some sort of semblance of their former lives could be maintained. The roughly 50 years of Babylonian rule, to us, is a virtual dark age because we have very little documentation from this period. We can, however, make a partial sketch of life outside of Judah by comparing the beginning stages and the end stages of the exile, especially as it's reflected in the prophetic texts. So, Jehoiakim's son, along with Jerusalem's royal elite, surrendered in 597, and they were transferred to the city of Babylon, where they became state pensioners. We have cuneiform documents from Nebuchadnezzar's 13th year that record that Jehoiakim, king of the land of Judah, and his 5 sons, together with foreign dignitaries, were confined to Babylon and received food rations. There were a lot of other Judeans, aside from the king, who were on that same roster. Some of these people were skilled workers, masons, architects, builders, even gardeners. The main body of exiles, of which there were probably tens of thousands, settled in the border areas between Assyria and Babylonia. These were areas that had been heavily damaged during the wars between these two powers, and they settled in towns whose names suggested that official policy was to reclaim wastelands. So, for example, some Judeans settled in Tel Abib, which means the Mount of the Flood. This is referenced in Ezekiel 3:15. They settled in Tel Harsha, which is the Mound of Potsherds. And they settled in Tel Melah, which is the Mound of Salt. That's referenced in Ezra 2, verse 59. These communities were self-governing units. The elders of the community and heads of families took over communal duties, and this was all done under the auspices of Babylonian authorities, but they were given a fair deal of autonomy. The Judeans didn't live alone in these places. There were also deportees from Tyre, Ashkelon, Gaza, and other cities, all living side by side. All of these communities maintained some degree of ethnic identity in their captivity. This was very different from the Assyrian way of doing business, where captive peoples were forced to mingle in order to destroy their identities. Once the return to Judah had become an option, the list of Judeans who made the journey home shows that the exiles had held on to genealogical records as well as oral family traditions, so that even the various orders of priests could take up their positions once given the chance. So Jeremiah's picture of a comfortable exile, described in Jeremiah 29, 5-7, was not just wishful thinking. So I'll quote 29, 5-7. Jeremiah says, "Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." So, with that being said, the maintenance of an ethnic identity for exiled Jews was still conditioned by their contact with Babylonian society. So, for example, language was always a ready vehicle for assimilation. Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Near East, replaced Hebrew in day-to-day conversations and in commerce. So, Hebrew seems to have remained the preferred literary vehicle. Parts of Ezra, Nehemiah, and the late biblical book of Daniel are actually written in Aramaic. Babylonian month names, in their Aramaic forms, replaced the common Hebrew month names, and epigraphy, which is carvings in stone, finds that Hebrew script, which had been in use during the period of the monarchy, gave way to Aramaic script. There's a later tradition that credits Ezra the scribe with transcribing the 5 books of the Pentateuch into the new script, while at the same time preserving the original Hebrew text. There was even a change in Judean onomastics, that is, in names. Babylonian personal names, which include the names of Babylonian divinities, start becoming adopted by the exiles. So even among the line of David, you can find names like Zerubbabel, which is the seed of Babylon. You would find Shenazar, which means the god Sin, who's a lunar god, protects. You'd even find a name like Shawasharusur, which means Shamash protects the king. Shamash is a Babylonian sun god. So, probably the biggest issue that was faced by the exiles in terms of maintaining their ethnic identity was the lack of organized public worship. Israelite ritual law prohibited sacrifice outside the borders of the Promised Land, because all other lands were considered unclean insofar as they were defiled by idolatry. So the exiles couldn't reestablish a communion through sacrifice with Yahweh in the traditional method. Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel taught that the Lord's distancing himself from his people by the destruction of the temple was part of their punishment. So under these circumstances, certain ritual acts whose observance was not restricted to the national home acquired a new significance. So the weekly Sabbath and the covenant of circumcision developed into clear ethnic markers for the exiles. It's in this phase that we get an institution which we could maybe call a proto-synagogue. At public gatherings on fast days, the exiles lamented the loss of their former homeland and prayed for a speedy return. It was on these occasions that teachings of prophets and readings from the Torah and other texts from pre-exilic times may have filled a spiritual void for the exiled Judeans. We can get a decent idea of the spiritual climate in these communities by reading Ezekiel, which is a collection of oracles from a prophet who was among those deported with Jehoiakim. Ezekiel ministered to those Jews living in Tel Abib, which was a town in southern Babylonia, and Ezekiel ministered for about 30 years. He was regularly visited by elders of Judah who came to hear his pronouncements on matters concerning national identity. Ezekiel assured his listeners that the city of Babylon was doomed, and he insisted that on account of their wanderings and their idolatry, punishment awaited them. Whereas some of Ezekiel's listeners held to the view that their sufferings were the consequence of an inherited guilt. So they believed that the sins of the father were being atoned by the son. The prophet, however, rejected this idea in favor of a doctrine of individual responsibility. Ezekiel 18:4 says, "It is only the person who sins that shall die." He urged everyone to consider their ways, quote, "with a new heart and a new spirit." Following the old motif that we've discussed a lot, Ezekiel was sure that although his generation was being punished, they would surely be restored. Once news of Babylon's fall reached the exiles, Ezekiel turned his attention to the future. And while Israel remained undeserving of God's mercy, he envisioned the revival of dry bones, and both houses of Israel forcefully repatriated to the land of Israel in a new exodus. The prophet had a utopian program for rebuilding Jerusalem, and the temple remained an unrealized dream. On the other hand, this utopian program contributed to keeping up the hopes of redemption alive. Around this hope, the exiled Judeans clung to their personal identity. Alright, so let's move on and talk about the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the hope for return to Jerusalem. So, Babylon was relatively short-lived as an empire. The Neo-Babylonians, of course. For the most part, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was dominated by two famous rulers. Nebuchadnezzar, whose dates are 604 to 562 BC, and Nabonidus, whose dates are 556 to 539 BC. So, whereas Nebuchadnezzar took up the challenge of re-establishing Mesopotamian rule over the whole Near East in the power vacuum left behind by the demise of the Assyrian Empire, and whereas he left a record of conquest abroad and building at home, Nabonidus forsook his capital for a desert oasis and then lost it without a battle to Cyrus the Great, the first Persian emperor. As far as the Judean exiles are concerned, it's Nebuchadnezzar, whose name is seared into collective memory. It was Nebuchadnezzar who razed Jerusalem and had Judah deported to Babylon. Now, on this account, there's a whole plethora of derisive and really derogatory tales that grew out of this event on the side of Judean writers. Where Babylonian kings were busy with protecting and developing trade centers in the west, a new power eventually arose to challenge Babylon, and this came from the east on the Iranian plateau. Under the leadership of Cyrus, who had rebelled over his Median overlord, the Persians fought their way across the Anatolian peninsula and conquered as far as the Lydian capital of Sardis, which is really not far from the Aegean Sea. This is where coinage was invented, in Lydia. This was a Greek city, as far as ethnicity is concerned. So by 546 BC, the Babylonian Empire was surrounded. Power was in Cyrus's hands. In the year 539 BC of the Babylonian Chronicle records, it says that the Persians defeated the Babylonian army at Opis and Sippar in late summer, after which, quote, "The army of Cyrus entered Babylon without a battle," end quote, and Cyrus declared peace to all. In the biblical tradition, the fall of Babylon is associated with Belshazzar. This is where you get the story of God's handwriting on the palace walls, where he tells people to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow they would die. That story is found in Daniel. A group of priests of Marduk in Babylon wrote a propagandistic inscription for Cyrus, and they welcomed the Persian king in the name of their god. The inscription states, Marduk beheld with pleasure Cyrus's good deeds and his upright heart, and therefore ordered him to march against his own city, Babylon. Without any battle, he made him enter his town, Babylon, sparing Babylon any calamity. He delivered into his hands Nabonidus, the king who did not worship him. This was the eloquent apology that signaled the orderly transfer of power from Babylonian rulership to Persian rulership. Ever the opportunists these priests were. So, among the Judean exiles in Babylonia, expectations ran high for the imminent fall of Nabonidus. The Jews looked to Cyrus as their deliverer. In the Bible, a so-called second Isaiah speaks of Cyrus as God's quote-unquote anointed. This is a Christ figure, raised up to subdue the nations so that, in the end, Israel might be set free and Jerusalem could be rebuilt. Jeremiah had predicted that Judea would be enslaved for 70 years in Babylon, and this time hadn't yet elapsed, but in Hebrew, the number 70 is more a signifier of completeness. It's a mystical number rather than a literal number. So, the Judeans were allowed to return, and the prophets continued to call out to the people to give up idolatry, to give up the futile worship of wood and stone that, quote, cannot save. That's Isaiah 45:20. And they held out the promise that those who would embrace Israel's faith would be welcomed into a new Zion. Here's a quotation from Isaiah 56, verses 6 and 7. And the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it, and hold fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain. These I will make joyful in my house of prayer. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. So, just how many foreigners, if any, actually took up the call and attached themselves to the community of exiles can't be determined. But what's important here is that the Jewish faith now opened its doors to converts from other nations to worship the Lord and to rebuild a resplendent Jerusalem. Okay, so let's move on. I want to spend a bit of time discussing why we spend so much time on Israel and Greece if we're supposed to be doing a history of the world in general. Well, it's because Israel and Greece are the fountainheads of history itself. Both the Greeks and the Israelites were historically minded people. Now, obviously, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, they all used chronicles or annals of past rulers, past events, and great deeds, but these were a means of propaganda. They were a means of legitimizing present rule. In Israel and in Greece, however, we see the use of history to draw lessons for the sake of improving the present and the future. The first true work of history was not that of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, but it was the Book of Samuel. The book of Samuel is a story about the rise and fall of a small regional superpower. It was the first attempt to recount the past, interpret it, and then relate it to the present. In Israel, history began as a means of explaining the ways of God to men. We can contrast this to the Greek tradition, wherein Herodotus, the so-called father of history, wrote that history is to preserve the memory of the past by putting on record the astonishing achievements, the kleos, the glory, both of the Greeks and the non-Greeks, and more particularly, to show how the two races came into conflict. History means inquiry. It means asking questions. Don't let anybody tell you that history somehow is some green language for his story, and that's this gendered concept. It's not. There is no history and herstory. It's inquiry. It comes from historia, the Greek word for inquiry. So here in Israel and in Greece, there are two distinct angles at work here. And an interesting point of overlap between the story of both of these cultures was their contact with the world superpower of Persia. In 538, the Jews returned from their captivity in Babylon, and they did so on account of their liberation by Persian hands. Persia was the culmination of the imperial history of the Middle East up to this point. It was the greatest of all the Middle Eastern empires up to date because it married the legacies of Egypt and Babylon and brought the whole region under the aegis of Zoroastrianism, under the aegis of the worship of one great God, Ahura Mazda, the Lord of truth and light. Zoroastrianism was we can say rather loosely, a dualistic religion based on the teachings of a prophet named Zarathustra, or sometimes we call him the Zoroaster. It's debatable, but we could say that Zarathustra was one of the earliest Axial Age teachers. We'll talk a lot about the Axial Age in upcoming lectures, because we're getting into that period. Okay, so we talked about how Cyrus founded the Persian Empire, and next up on the list is Darius, or Darius. These are interchangeable pronunciations. If Cyrus founded the Persian Empire, it was Darius who consolidated the empire. The Persian Empire stretched all the way from Pakistan in the east to Egypt in the southwest and the Danube in the northwest. This empire was larger than the continental United States, just to put things into perspective, and Persia's influence, though not its rule, stretched out all the way to Carthage and Tunisia onto the Atlantic coast of Morocco. The empire was divided into 20 satrapies or provinces. It had a vast standing army, the largest yet seen on the planet, and until 490 BC, that army had never known defeat. The kings of Persia fostered a relatively free market economy, and this all functioned beneath the absolute despotism of the king. Or, I should say, the King of Kings, the Shah Ra Shah. Darius's inscriptions still speak to us with very little ambiguity. I am Darius, King of kings, Lord of lords, King over the four corners of the universe. Remember this title? I have conquered by the will of Ahura Mazda. All who oppose me have been crushed, and those who say they are free lie, for I rule all things. We'll come back later to talk about Persia in more detail. In closing, I want to discuss the great 19th century sonnet by the poet Percy Shelley, the husband of the great Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. This was published in 1826, and it is entitled Ozymandias. Ozymandias was an alternative name for the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II, but I think that this poem speaks volumes for every absolute ruler. I'll read it for you now. I met a traveler from an antique land who said 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Shelley was a great student of history, and he understood the inevitable decline of all despots and of all empires. Both the bones of kings and the bones of animals turn to dust. Any attempt to cling to the present, to cling to anything, is a violation against the law of impermanence. Everything flows. Pantare, as Heraclitus said. You can never step in the same river twice, and it is the hubris and the arrogance of these emperors to think that they could set up an empire that would outlast their dynasties, which would become their undoing. Alright, with that said, this marks the end of our discussion. You've been listening to Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, Part 10, and I'm your host, Dan Uttrell. Thanks for listening.